Hey everybody, this is an interview with Phyllis and Julius Jacobson by Kent Worcester. Uh, I'm getting this from the New Politics website, but it says this interview was originally published in Left History, Volume 18, Number 1. Here we go. Phyllis Jacobson lived from 1922 to 2010, and Julius Jacobson lived from 1922 to 2003. Both were socialist activists in New York City from the mid-1930s through the first years of the 20th century. They were members of a radical generation that came of age during the Great Depression and embraced the language of socialism, communism, and Marxism. They were also the children of working-class Jewish immigrants who grew up in the city's outer boroughs. For their parents, the First World War, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the general strikes and mass uprisings that convulsed many countries after the war were all recent events. The near collapse of the global economy in the early 1930s confirmed for many of their cohort the basic assumption that capitalism was inherently impermanent. Adopting a socialist outlook in a period characterized by social upheaval and economic crisis was easy. The challenge had to do with selecting a suitable group or tendency from a vociferous menu of options. In contrast to many of their peers, both Phyllis and Julius were instinctively critical of the Communist Party and those sections of the left that expressed political solidarity with the USSR. As teenagers, they gravitated toward the much smaller Trotskyist movement, which is where they first met. By the time they were adults, they had decisively broken with anything resembling an orthodox Trotskyist position. The Jacobsons remained active on the radical left, however, and helped carve out an independent socialist perspective that was grounded in a democratic interpretation of Marxism. Their pro-labor, pro-human rights, anti-authoritarian, and anti-capitalist worldview continues to find expression in the pages of New Politics, an independently published, quote, Journal of Socialist Thought, end quote, which the Jacobsons launched in 1961 and edited for many years. During the first half of their lives, they came of age, fell in love, and were active in a succession of socialist organizations. During the second half, their lives revolved around their magazine, various book projects, friendships, summer travels, and their son. The interview that follows tracks their political trajectory from Trotskyism to third camp socialism and offers a window into their lively and engaging personalities as well as their principles and values. Like many leftists of their generation, the Jacobsons were comfortable referring to themselves as radicals, socialists, or even Marxists, but they often use the term, quote, third camp socialist, which might not be familiar to some readers. Neither Trotskyists nor communists were keen on this terminology. Trotsky and his followers viewed the Soviet Union as a, quote, degenerated workers' state and saw it as an improvement on the capitalist West, despite its cruel bureaucratic excesses. The Trotskyists called for the, quote, defense of the Soviet Union. Communists, meanwhile, regarded, quote, Trotskyites and so-called, quote, anti-Stalinists as red baiters who were objectively working on behalf of the State Department and later on the CIA. In this context, the term, quote, third camp was used by people like the Jacobsons to distinguish their preferred form of socialism from both the Soviet model and either U.S.-style Democratic Party liberalism or electoral socialism, otherwise known as social democracy. It was in this third camp milieu that the phrase, quote, neither Washington nor Moscow, but international socialism, end quote, was first coined. A key figure in this story is that of Max Shachtman, who lived from 1904 to 1972, their longtime friend and mentor. Along with James P. Cannon, Shachtman was a leading Trotskyist during the 1930s and one of the movement's public faces. Shachtman had been active in the Communist Party in the 20s and early 30s and was close to Cannon for much of this time. By the late 1930s, however, Shachtman had developed deep misgivings about Cannon's approach to party building and about the Trotskyist line on the degenerated but ultimately progressive nature of the Soviet Union. I have a bunch of shit on here from Max Shachtman. I think I might even have pieces on here from Cannon. But one of the critiques one of the things that, like, some of the articles that I've read kind of make the argument that, and this is something that I think a lot of Third Campus would say of Trotskyists in general, get their conception of, like, the party from the specific environment of Bolshevization in the mid 1920s. A lot of people use the words like Zinovievist conception of the party, which I'm not, I don't have too much strength to speak on that, but it was a very, basically, in so many words, this was a very much more hierarchical and a very hierarchical and what's the word? Disciplinarian and authoritarian form of party politics than at least third camp socialists, or especially those in the Trotskyist tradition, argue that was the nature of Bolshevism prior to Bolshevization. So there's this kind of idea. Basically, the Shachtmanites argue that Cannon gets his conception of the party from Zinoviev, and I think, what's his name? Ernest Haberkorn makes the same argument about Trotsky himself. Anyway. Where the hell am I? The Jacobsons were closely aligned with Shachtman during the resulting 1939 to 1940 factional battle inside the Socialist Workers' Party U.S. While Shachtman's supporters constituted a minority of party members, they enjoyed the vocal support of a majority of the party's youth wing. Expelled in 1940, Shachtman's faction quickly launched the Workers' Party, which existed from 1940 to 1949, and then the Independent Socialist League, which existed from 1949 to 1958. While Shachtman continued to regard himself as a democratic socialist after the Independent Socialist League disbanded, Shachtman became increasingly supportive of U.S. foreign policy during the 1960s and worked behind the scenes as an advisor to hawkish pro-war forces inside the ranks of organized labor and the Democratic Party. If you're interested more on the biography of Shachtman in this later period, check out the Shachtman biography that I have on this channel by Peter Drucker. Prior to Shachtman's tack to the right, the Jacobsons collaborated with the one-time Trotskyist spokesman in building the Workers' Party and the Independent Socialist League. It should note that Shachtman's turn to the right was kind of it's a little difficult to say because he was still a socialist, and he was still some type of democratic socialist in the 1960s. But he was definitely an anti-communist socialist. Anti-communist being anti-Stalinist basically, and viewed the spread of Stalinist type revolutions as anathema to socialism. So Shachtman, and I'm not too sure about I'm not an expert on all of these topics, but Shachtman, for instance, supported the U.S. Intervention in Vietnam on anti-communist grounds, right? But he was still a socialist, and he didn't view, he didn't become an anti-socialist. He didn't become a right-winger in the strict sense, but became a pretty fervent anti-communist, operating within the generic leftish wing of Democratic Party politics. I'm pretty sure, who the hell is he in support of? He was against, who was it, McGovern? That was the anti-war candidate in the Democratic Party that people canvassed for. He was against him. So it was he kind of had a very weird political disposition. On the one hand, he was very much far left in terms of like the mainstream of like Democratic Party politics, and that's kind of his thing. He becomes more of like a social democrat and kind of like tries to like in some sense like drop, I guess, what someone might call like ideological pretenses about like um working class revolution. Instead tried to like sought to like develop I guess like the labor movement and uh democratic politics in the United States in a way that was like not revolutionary or like particularly ideologically stamped, or like I don't know, didn't have like I guess like grandiose narratives about like the future of society. Um, so there's another thought that I had. And kind of was like adopted like the American labor movement like as is. So he got more involved in, I guess, in just like the mainstream of like labor movement politics in the United States. Um, Still a socialist, but an advocate, and was definitely like on the left wing of society in general, but not in terms of you know I don't know if there's a strictly speaking left wing um, necessarily like a left wing position, a strictly speaking left wing position that you can kind of use as like a standard when it comes to like foreign policy. I don't know if you can or not. You could argue that like it was most far like the Orthodox Trotskyists were most far left in supporting the Soviet Union in the Cold War. You would say they were more far left than the Workers' Party, but I wouldn't use that. I don't think that description is actually appropriate. So you know, obviously this piece isn't about Shachtman, and it makes sense to say Shachtman moved to the right in terms of like definitely supporting like hawkish. I think it's apt to say that he supported like hawkish anti-communism. But generally speaking, in addition to that, he still had was a democratic socialist of some kind. Anyway, the Jacobsons contributed articles and essays to Labor Action, the Third Camp's newspaper, as well as the New International, its theoretical magazine. In addition to its regular publication, the Shachtmanites hosted public meetings, conducted labor solidarity campaigns, sold pamphlets and books, maintained rank-and-file caucuses in a number of workplaces, and sponsored candidates in a couple of New York City electoral races in the 1940s. Julius and Phyllis participated in most, if not all, of these activities. During the war, Phyllis worked as a machinist in Brooklyn and was active in her union and inside the organization. Phyllis's husband served in the U.S. Army between 1942 and 1945, taking part in the Battle of the Bulge and the liberation of Paris. After the war, Julius Jacobson played a key role in launching the party's youth wing, the Socialist Youth League, using the pen name Julius Falk. Julius Jacobson was the founding editor of the League's magazine, Anvil, and subsequently served as an editor of New International, which folded by the end of the 1950s, or at the end of the 1950s, when the Independent Socialist League dissolved itself into the Socialist Party. By this point, the Jacobsons were personally familiar with a wide swath of the non-communist left in and around New York City. Some of the writers and intellectuals who spent time in their company at one time or another in the 1940s and 1950s included the literary critic Irving Howe, the Marxist theorist Hal Draper, the labor journalist B.J. Wittick, the novelist Harvey Swadus, and the painter and cartoonist Jesse Cohen, who was sometimes known as Carlo, the civil rights activist Bayard Rustin, the political scientist Bogdan Denich, and the best-selling author and speaker Michael Harrington, of Democratic Socialists of America fame. Bayard Rustin was someone, also, to my understanding, that Max Shachtman himself was politically close to. Yes, continuing on. Following their break with Shachtman, the Jacobsons launched New Politics in hopes of providing a, quote, forum permitting and encouraging a free play of discussion, controversy, and the counterposition of ideas, and an opportunity for all socialist views from the left to right to confront not only the political reality, but also each other and their critics, end quote. See the article Why We Publish in issue 1. Yeah, and this is kind of like the problem, right? With like when you have like something so open as like New Politics, is that you kind of have people, you kind of have, you know, there's some degree which I think you could say that like when you do something like that, the paper itself kind of loses some of its identity, you know, and you could always be critical of some of the kind of like the people that were allowed to publish and the ideas that were published in New Politics. Not that it's wrong for people to have ideas or that it should be banned or something, but when you kind of try to have I think there's a contradiction. This is just from my kind of like own experience with like my very, very, very limited experience with just like doing basic socialist activities, is that like you kind of need like separate groupings and organizations in order to facilitate democracy while holding on to like actually like discernible identities, right? Like if you have on the one hand like if you have like you should probably have like a strictly third camp journal, and then like a journal that's kind of like more open to a diversity of ideas, right? So there'd be like New Politics maybe, right? And then there would be things like, I don't know, Historical Materialism Journal or Science and Society and those kind of things, where it is actually more of a open kind of discussion of ideas from people with radically different positions, right? Because if you start just having like whoever on the journal, it's kind of is like, well, what is the actual identity of this thing? Like, what ideas are we actually putting forward? Or is it just, and it's like, not that that's wrong at all by any means, but it seems like there still needs to be a thing where it's like, okay, we have like this thing where we talk, but then we have this thing where we like say what we mean, and it's kind of like focused on putting forward a particular type of politics, as opposed to just being kind of like an open forum. Because I guarantee that the people who on the forum that weren't part of like third camp Trotskyism or third camp socialism did in fact have their own magazines where they themselves put forward their ideas in a rather one-sided way. Thank you for allowing me to riff with my thoughts here. The impressive momentum achieved by the civil rights movement and the emergence of campus-based and anti-war movements put wind in their sails. From New Politics' inception, Julius served as the editor-in-chief in tandem with a small editorial board and a larger number of sponsors. Phyllis's name was officially added to the editorial board in 1968, but Phyllis had been closely involved with its development from the outset. 45 issues of New Politics appeared between 1961 and 1978, before the Jacobsons suspended publication. Detecting a revival of interest in left-wing ideas, Phyllis and Julius relaunched the journal in 1986. The print version currently appears twice a year, and the editorial board maintains a website and multi-authored blog at www.newpol.org, which is where I'm getting this article from. In the early 1980s, the Jacobsons co-edited a book titled Socialist Perspectives, which represented a trial run for the new series. I'm going to look that up. I'm not really seeing any good descriptions for this book. Just that it was published in 1983. Anyway. Julius had previously put together two collections of articles taken from New Politics, The Negro and the American Labor Movement, published in 1968, and Soviet Communism and the Socialist Vision. In that book, in Soviet Communism and the Socialist Vision, has the journal has the article, what's it? Hal Draper, The Anatomy of an Apologist by Julius Jacobson. A third collection, titled Autocracy and Insurgency in Organized Labor, published in 1972, was edited by Burton Hall. Let's see if there's anything for that. The description for Autocracy and Insurgency in Organized Labor, edited by Burton Hall, says, during a period when serious writing on the American labor movement was at an absolute premium, the contributors to New Politics magazine created a body of literature distinguished by its clear-eyed vision of the limits and prospects of the working class, assuming neither a, quote, end of ideology nor the, quote, destruction of the working class. These writings are characterized by a precision matching their high purpose. This collection of essays is unique in providing voice to insurgent members of such unions as the National Maritime Union, the Seafarers International, the Brotherhood of Painters, the Federation of Teachers, the Miners' Union, and others. Rank and filers describe their efforts to achieve membership participation and control of their unions. Progressive unions like Harry Bridges' West Coast Longshoremen's Union and the International Ladies Garment Workers Union are examined, as are some traditionally more conservative, quote, business unions. Officials of some of these unions comment and are answered by their critics. This volume will be particularly useful to those interested in problems of work and labor in American society, and problems of mass and elite behavior in American industry, and to those who have came to realize that the working class, whether in ethnic or Americanist guise, remains a potent force in the political, economic, and social life of the United States in the 70s. One second. Sorry. Back to the text. Additional bibliographic resources are listed in the, quote, further reading section that appends the interview. This interview is taken from 3 taped conversations with Phyllis and Julius Jacobson that the author conducted in November 1992, September 1994, and November 1994. It incorporates with permission a small amount of material from an interview conducted by the labor historian John Bloom in November 1983. "11 of Julius's articles and reviews are posted on the Marxist Internet Archive, and New Politics maintains a collection of articles and reviews by Phyllis." Section 1. Joining the movement. Worcester. Tell me how you came to join the movement. Julius Jacobson. I was brought up in New York during the Depression. Virtually everyone was a radical then, a communist, socialist, social democrat, or Trotskyist. You were something. My parents were born in Latvia and met each other in England. They later migrated to the United States. We lived in the Bronx. It was a period of rent strikes, housing evictions, and demonstrations. That was the atmosphere when I grew up. I joined the Young Pioneers, which was the junior section of the Communist Party, but I broke away at the age of 13. That was young, but it wasn't all that unusual. What was unusual was to break away from the young pioneers and to join a Trotskyist organization, after which, of course, I was persona non grata. The other children already had the mentality of older Stalinists. I lost all my friends. My Aunt Bessie, who was a third period Stalinist, she was out of her mind. Phyllis Jacobson says she truly was. Julius Jacobson. Anyway, she loved me dearly but would not talk to me, which will give you a flavor of those years. At that point, I went to the Socialist Party's Young People's Socialist League as a member of the Trotskyist faction. 2 years later, we split from the Socialist Party, which I think was a mistake. The split came about as a result of Trotsky's pressure. I don't think that either Cannon or Shachtman were for it, but we did have differences with the Socialist Party over the question of the Spanish Civil War, and in those days, everything became a split issue. Yeah, this is the like Trotsky in this period. You know, this is like the French turn or whatever, and international Trotskyism, where it was like what was recommended was entrism into socialist parties to agitate and to organize and find recruits. But then Trotsky, to my understanding at least, urged the split, all the parties to split out of the socialist and social democratic parties in the mid 30s or in the later 30s, because he decided that the time of world revolution could come, and it was time for the Trotskyists to take their recruits and leave the socialist parties and become truly vanguard parties. So I think this is the context and what he's speaking about here, from my understanding at least. Phyllis Jacobson says, yes, well, I came out of a different background than Julie did. My father was born in a part of Austria that had previously been Poland and came here as a very young man. Like many Europeans of his generation, my father was a social democrat. He worked as a waiter. My sister and I grew up in a household where you had to be a union person and a socialist. That was the temper of the times. I joined the Young People's Socialist League when I was in high school. I must have been about 14. The high school I attended in Bensonhurst had a large number of communist teachers. Many later on were victims of McCarthyism, but some of them were absolutely intolerant of opposing ideas. And when I went to Brooklyn College, there was a number of professors who were close to or members of the Communist Party. Some of the faculty were really terrible. It became a battle of wits. You had people like V, who would say, quote, if there's any member of the Trotskyite flea circus here, I suggest they leave, end quote. This was a professor of English, one of the country's foremost Shakespeare scholars. But you have to understand that at Brooklyn College in that period, I was there from 1938 to 1942, many students were involved in radical activities. When you went to school on Wednesday, which was the day for extracurricular activities, you walked through a gauntlet of political clubs and sects, some of which I'm sure you've never heard of, and everyone took it all very seriously. Students read the material, they're up on exactly what was going on. That was the nature of the period. We had a fairly large group at Brooklyn College as such groups went. We must have had about 30 members and a fair number of sympathizers. We had very good meetings. Shachtman regularly speak on campus, as did other party leaders. The war broke out while I was still at college, and when I left school, I went to work in a factory. The factory was in Hoboken, and I worked alongside a communist partier who would hand me pamphlets by Clara Zetkin on the women question. This guy turned out to be Murray Handwerker, who went on to become the owner of Nathan's Famous. His father founded Nathan's but had disowned his son because he joined Nathan's workers on the picket line when they were organizing. After a while, I got a job at Sperry, which was difficult because it turned out that I scored too high on the test. That was a problem for many comrades. When you went to these large factories, they gave you some sort of test, part of which was written and part of which concerned manual dexterity and so on. It was hard to suppress what you knew. Most people scored a little high, and they were very suspicious if you scored well on the test. I don't know what lies I told them. I certainly didn't tell them I had gone to college. But I was hired at Sperry and went to work in the shop, which was a lively place. I started out as an inspector, but after a very short time I became a first piece inspector, which was interesting, because what I had to do was to check the first piece of work that came off a machine to make certain the machine was set up properly. I had to read blueprints and had to work with inspection materials, dial indicators, and so on. At first, the other workers didn't very much like the notion of having a woman as a first piece inspector, but I didn't earn as much as they did. I still remember that I earned 85 cents an hour, while the man doing the same work earned $1.25, and we had to work 9 hours a day, 6 days a week. Julius Jacobson says, when I graduated high school, things were very rough. I used to work part-time jobs at the weekend and so on. At that point, the Socialist Workers' Party had opened up a print shop and was determined that I would go through the training program offered by the New York School of Printing. After 3 or 4 months at the school, I went to work as a compositor at the party print shop. As a compositor, I made up the pages of the Socialist Appeal, the New International, the pamphlets, and so on. The shop consisted of a group of around 6 or 7 comrades. We had 2 linotypists, 2 pressmen, a compositor, and someone doing the secretarial work. It was organized as a regular shop. Phyllis Jacobson. There was a strike in the party print shop. Julius Jacobson. Don't be hilarious. But we were making around $8 a week or something like that. It wasn't very much, but after all, we were considered professional revolutionaries. At a certain point, however, a number of us felt we should get something a little more substantial than what we were getting, that the party could offer another $2 or $3. We met with Shachtman and presented our grievances. Max said, "Oh no, the party can't afford it." We argued back and forth. I don't remember if it ever got to the point where we downed tools, but we certainly threatened, and there were all sorts of negotiations, and finally we won our demands. As far as dues were concerned, we had a progressive tax system. ... Phyllis Jacobson, based on what you earned. Julius Jacobson, where you had to tell the party how much you earned and pay a percentage of that. Phyllis Jacobson, everyone accepted that. Julius Jacobson, it was the least you could do, but more importantly, you had to be active in the movement 3, 4, 5 nights a week. Worcester. This was just before the 1939 to 1940 split between the Cannon Camp and the Shachtmanites. Jacobson. It was Trotsky who really wanted to split the organization. Trotsky would not tolerate the Shachtman minority. Trotsky really split the organization. Trotsky would not tolerate the Shachtman minority. The Shachtman position, which repudiated the idea that the Soviet Union should be defended in any way, involved a fundamental issue. See, this is important right here because it's usually kind of like, depending on who you ask, this split came about due to disagreement of how the minority was treated, as opposed to what the minority, as opposed to an ideological split, right? It was primarily due to the particularly non-democratic nature of James Buchanan's leadership that fundamentally caused the split, because obviously Cannon was aligned with Trotsky on the degenerated workers' state thesis, and his level of tolerance was minimal. But Trotsky said, "Oh, we should avoid a split if someone says, the USSR needs a political revolution but should be defended, whether or not they call it a degenerated worker state or not is kind of inconsequential. But generally speaking, if someone dropped the degenerated worker state thesis and opted for something at least akin or sympathetic to the bureaucratic collectivist position, then they were fundamentally changing their orientation to defensism in the case of the Soviet Union." But anyway, the Shachtman position, which repudiated this is still Julius Jacobson speaking, which repudiated the idea that the Soviet Union should be defended in any way involved a fundamental issue. To Trotsky, it meant repudiating the idea of Russia as a degenerated worker state, and Trotsky was right. That was the implication of our point of view, although Shachtman never rejected the idea of Russia being a genuine worker state until after the split. And I think that's one of the reasons why people say that, like, the split in the Socialist Workers' Party was not about the Russian question, because Shachtman merely had doubts at this point, as opposed to firmly saying bureaucratic collectivism. Anyway, the longer the faction fight went on, the weaker Cannon's position became. The debates were one side and history is on the side of the Shachtmanites. The entire youth section, which was the most dynamic part of the movement, Phyllis Jacobson says, were Shachtmanite. It's very sad for us because you have to remember that despite the fact that we were very critical of Cannon, we were very saddened because Cannon was a very important figure in the movement. Aside from everything else, Cannon was a very romantic figure. Cannon was a wonderful speaker who could quote Keats, Shelley, and the great poets. That's interesting because a lot of portraits of Cannon kind of make him sound like a, strictly like, rough and tumble working class guy. Cannon was a 19th century type of orator, unlike Shachtman or C.L.R. James, who were also important speakers, and it's sadness to see that Shachtman, who was brilliant, could make him look foolish. Julius Jacobson. It was painful. Phyllis Jacobson, because he knew nothing about theory. Now that sounds like what people usually say about Cannon. Kent Worcester says, but he knew something about America. Phyllis Jacobson. Yes, he did. He knew something about the labor movement. However, it has to be said that there was something tremendously anti-intellectual about the Cannon group. Section 2. The Workers' Party during the war. Julius Jacobson. So that was one big change, but some things stayed the same. When the Workers' Party was organized, we called ourselves a party, and we thought of ourselves as a small mass party. It was an illusion that was very hard to sustain, because the reality was that we were not a party. We were not recruiting large numbers of people, even though we were very active in the factories during the war. For an organization our size, we had a real impact, particularly in the United Auto Workers Union and somewhat in the United Electrical Workers Union. In the United Electrical Workers, UE, and more generally as a political force inside the labor movement. But the fact is that we did not emerge out of all this as a party. We did recruit, but we weren't able to hold on to a lot of the people we recruited from the shops. And by 1947 to 1948, it dawned on us that it was very demoralizing to call ourselves a party and yet not be a party. This was the point at which we transformed ourselves into the Independent Socialist League. What it meant was acknowledging the reality of what we were and what it meant in terms of becoming a somewhat looser organization. There were some things we did as the Workers' Party which we never would have done operating as a league. For example, in the early years, we had a policy of sending our members, mostly young people, into industry. And it was wrong because a lot of people weren't psychologically prepared for it. People were talked into leaving white-collar jobs or college to take jobs in shops. Phyllis Jacobson. One of the aims of the industrialization policy was to catch up with what the Communist Party had done much earlier. After all, the Communist Party had been very successful in sending their people into the factories and helping to organize the CIO. We also told people that they had to leave New York and go to Cleveland or Detroit or Buffalo, which is what people did. If you're curious, my grandfather, when he was getting his apprenticeship as a machinist, the first shop steward he had was a communist, which must have been something quite strange coming from like a working class Irish background to come across a communist. Been very weird. I don't know if you ever came across one again. Worcester. What were your expectations about the war and about the direction in which the country would go after the war ended? Julius Jacobson. Our point of view shifted. When the war broke out, we adopted a misguided point of view, which is that in the course of the war, America would become a fascist state, that it could not fight a democratic war in a democratic way, and that the consequences of such a war would be such that we would end up with a dictatorship, and that became one of the reasons for our opposition to the war. Worcester. Did you see Roosevelt as a potential fascist? Julius Jacobson. It wasn't so much Roosevelt as a transformation of the whole society. We anticipated that under the pressure of war there would be a suppression of trade unions. Phyllis Jacobson. Of free speech. Julius Jacobson. And that there would be a militarization of American life. Once everyone realized that it was going to be a long war, that Germany was not about to be thrown back. We expected that in the context of the war against fascism, we would wind up becoming a fascist society ourselves. We had meetings on this subject and drafted resolutions. We denounced the war. That was one difference between us and the Socialist Workers' Party. The Socialist Workers' Party had a similar point of view, but they also had a policy of, quote, preserving the cadre, end quote, so they laid low. Worcester. What did opposition to the war mean in practice? Julius Jacobson. It meant, for one thing, the way in which we characterized the war. We always used to put the question in the following terms. If you were a member of Congress, how would you vote when it came to war appropriations? This is a sort of fancy way of looking at the problem, but the idea was, it was a way of testing your position, and we said no. We held the view that the revolutionary left held during World War I, and in that, of course, we were wrong. That's very interesting because I can't remember where the fuck I found it at, but it was like some kind of I think it was from Dirk Braunstein, who's like I don't know if he's president or something. He's an important figure in the Frankfurt School, like the actual Frankfurt School currently, and he's like wrote a book called Adorno's Critique of Political Economy, and I think he's kind of like, I don't want to say I don't really like saying people are part of the anti-Deutsch, because anti-Deutsch is kind of like, kind of have said influence beyond like its immediate circle of politics, right? Like I don't know if you'd call, for instance, Anselm Joppa or like Crisis or like Robert Kurtz as anti-Deutsch people, but they're definitely influenced by that like reappraisal of Middle East politics in the 1990s that kind of went down and developed into the 2000s in Germany. But anyway, that's not particularly relevant, but one of the things that he has, I can't remember if it's on Communist in Situ or what. I want to find it again because it was actually good. But it's just kind of like a list of like groups of people. It's kind of like, I don't know, not necessarily productive, but because it's kind of just like snarky and dickish in terms of like its tone. It's very polemical and like kind of funny. But one of the things they said is like, for like for the Bordigas, they said, don't understand the difference between World War I and World War II. And I think that's a very interesting thing. Whereas it's like, I don't know if you can really say that like the French Republic and Nazi Germany were the same thing. Or like saying that like United States and Nazi Germany were the same thing, and therefore it was a matter of indifference who won or lost the war, because they were both just different forms of imperialism, right? Whereas, and then but then like that doesn't make like the communist position right either, right? Or the capital C communist position right either, which was like, kind of Stalinistic anti-fascism, right? Which is extremely opportunistic and not consistently anti-fascist. And there's plenty of ways to demonstrate that, including the Nazi-Soviet pact, right? But there's kind of this idea within, like, I guess certain segments of, the, like, what you might term, like, the radical left, to the left of Trotsky. I don't know if you consider, like, third camp socialism and ultra-left. I wouldn't. But I would say it was still to the left of Trotskyism, as say, like council communism or something like that. And that's why certain people, such as Wayne Price, went from Shachtmanite Trotskyism to anarchism, made that transition. Anyway, but there's this convention on the left of kind of like not taking seriously the content or the democratic content, kind of just like not really thinking there's any kind of like progressive side in a war between two states, right? The more or less progressive side, right? So like, which is kind of distinct from a lot of 19th century socialism. So for instance, like, um, Bakunin and Marx thought the North should win. They might not have had illusions about they definitely didn't have illusions about the emancipatory aspects of the content of the Northern Republicans in the American Civil War, but they thought, relatively speaking, at the very least, a war against the slave owning class was progressive in terms of like who should win, right? And kind of how that view in general, like for instance, like as well, like Marx had a very like strong disdain for Tsarism, for instance. Not just in terms of like how it operated internationally, kind of viewed it as like the bulwark of reaction. And so there's a degree to which like I think he like I'm not exactly sure what I think he supported. I'm not exactly sure. So I might be talking on my ass here, but I believe he supported, for instance, like the British in the Crimean War. I'm not exactly sure if that's true. If you feel like it's a misrepresentation, then please comment. Um, he definitely viewed like between two warring states, um, not necessarily, but there could be a more progressive option. Um, and so there's like it's very very interesting to kind of look more deeply into like the Marxist history of war, and it's like kind of not. And if you think of like Peter Kropotkin, who made the assertion as opposed to who, like the Social Democrats, kind of like picked a side in World War One in favor of France against the German Empire. Um, like he, what rightly or wrongly, he was willing to say that within a given conflict, there is the side that should win. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting, just the idea, like how, because I feel like a lot of like people on the left, including myself, like kind of have like attitudes, right? Like they might not necessarily be an expert on various topics, but they kind of have attitudes, and their attitude is kind of like generically anti-war because, they're anti-state, or like none of the states that exist are currently progressive, or that it's just it's exclusively a self-serving power grab on the part of particular leaders, and there's not really any kind of substantial like defensive aspect to warfare. I don't know. I'm not really explaining it well because, like I said, I'm not an expert either. But it seems like, you know, like it seems as though like there's kind of just like attitudinal or like dispositional things. Like I'm an anti-militarist, but like I don't think that like like when you think of like the Nazi experience, what does it mean to be anti-militarist in a in a bourgeois republic compared to a fascist state? What does that mean? And this is kind of like to what degree do like Marxist even like, because a lot of them do or pay some kind of lip service to it, like just like civil liberties. Like, do civil liberties matter? Does it matter whether like the one side is like a theocracy or a or have like like an explicit policy of excluding a particular group legally from social life? What is the social content of the societies that are at war? Seems to be forgotten. Anyway, sorry, that was way too long. I'm kind of fucking this video up with my jabber, but I apologize for rambling. There are people, as just said. Julius Jacobson says, I meant it, opposition to the war meant, for one thing, the way in which we characterized the war. We always used to put the question in the following terms: if you were a member of Congress, how would you vote when it came to war appropriations? This is a sort of fancy way of looking at the problem. But the idea was, it was a way of testing our position. And we said no. We held the view that the revolutionary left held during World War I, and in that, of course, we were wrong. Worcester asks why. Jacobson says, well, for one thing, America did not become a fascist society. Also, we didn't take into consideration the stark differences between Nazism and the German system in World War I. It was wrong to see this kind of equivalency between the contending forces. Phyllis Jacobson, that could only be rationalized by saying that bourgeois democracy would not remain democratic for very long. Julius Jacobson said, we said, sure, there's a difference, but we didn't claim that bourgeois rule was the same as fascism. We didn't claim that bourgeois rule was the same as fascism, but we also said that you had to look at it dynamically and recognize that in the course of the war, bourgeois democracy would not be able to survive. Phyllis Jacobson, there's something else to consider. When your generation thinks about opposition to war, you think of Vietnam, and opposition to the Vietnam War meant refusing to serve in the army. But that was never true for us during World War II. Quite the contrary. Everyone served. Shachtman was furious later on during the Korean War, when young people in the movement did everything they could not to serve. Shachtman's attitude was quite despicable. Shachtman said they were cowards and yellow bellies. Shachtman equated with homosexuality. Shachtman was very homophobic. Julius Jacobson. Another important difference between the wars is that even before World War II started, it was obvious that Germany had the aim of colonizing the countries it defeated in battle, and that was not an operative factor during World War I. Germany didn't try to make a colony out of France, and France didn't intend to make a colony out of Germany, but this time things were different. I still don't think that the pro-war position was correct either. Even at the time, if you had to put a pistol to my head and said, you have to make a choice. Do you want to win? Who do you want to win, the Allies or the Axis? I would have said the Allies. But opposition to the war meant supporting the class struggle. During the war, you had authentic social democrats who wanted to reduce the level of struggle. That became a big consideration. Quote, well, a strike, how's that going to affect production? End quote. Quote, you want to make an issue of the segregated army, but how's that going to affect morale? End quote. And that was not a consideration for us. The way we developed the anti-war point of view in publications and in person was you prosecute the class struggle and the struggle for social justice. You make no concessions. That's very interesting because it seems like that's the position. If you think of like Spain, that would be like the position of like the POUM and the anarchists, right? The idea that like obviously they were anti-fascist too, and they would prefer victory of the Republic to the victory of Franco, but they they have their own independent third, you might not call it third camp, but their third camp position of advocating for the social revolution in the context of a war between two states who have different levels of progressiveness. Worcester says, did you run across fascists in the United States? Julius Jacobson, we used to fight with them. Before I joined the army, I worked alongside them at GE in the repair shop. Everyone there was a skilled worker, and many of them were German Americans. Things were so bad when I used to wash up after a day's work, I carried a knife with me. Worcester. Labor Action, the Workers' Party weekly newspaper, was distributed in the tens of thousands during the war. Phyllis Jacobson. It was given out at factory gates and in housing projects. One of the things we did was to go around to various places to try to meet as many people as possible. The idea was that it was possible to build a mass party. A primary locus of activity was giving labor action out at factory gates. Harvey Swados writes about this in his novel Standing Fast. published in 1970. Worcester. What kind of people were coming around the party during the war? During the war, we attracted people through our activity in the shops. It was very sad. A lot of them were drawn to the Workers' Party through the activity of those who were in leadership roles in rank-and-file opposition groups. But there was no real life for them. One of the advantages of the Communist Party was that they started with a movement which was large enough to provide new members with some sort of social life. We couldn't compete in that regard. We had one member, Max, who was an important figure in the UE. Max was very smart and enormously successful. He really knew how to explain to workers how the unions and companies operated. Max organized a huge opposition caucus and was able to bring all kinds of people around the Workers' Party. Julius Jacobson. The people he brought around were working people, and they weren't intellectuals. They would prefer to go on a Saturday night to a bar and have a beer, while we preferred to go to Greenwich Village and listen to jazz music. They had come around, but the movement became like a revolving door and went on for years. Phyllis Jacobson. Of course, during the war, it was the women members who basically had to maintain the organization in a very practical way, but they also worked. I can't think of one person who stayed at home, never. Worcester. Did you consider yourself a feminist? Were you comfortable with the term? Phyllis Jacobson. Oh yes, absolutely. As a matter of fact, I kept my own name. I did not use Julia's name. My name was Phyllis Garden. I used my own name at work. It wasn't until the 1960s when some bookkeepers where I was working said, quote, "Look, you're going to get in trouble because they're going to find a maiden name and a married name, and you'll have trouble with Social Security," end quote. So for that purpose, I started to use my married name. Julius Jacobson. We had reasonably decent attitudes. It's not that the attitude was bad, but the behavior was bad. Phyllis Jacobson. Yeah. We did know some outstanding feminists who were not necessarily in our movement, but were radicals. There were a number of such women in New York, but there were very few women in the leadership of the Workers' Party. Julius Jacobson. Women were always the ones who had to type up the resolutions. Phyllis Jacobson. Secretaries. Julius Jacobson. It was assumed that at every meeting you needed someone to take the minutes, and it was assumed that the minutes would be taken by a woman. Phyllis Jacobson. They played the same role as women in the New Left, until the women in the New Left became bold and said, quote, "We're not going to make coffee anymore," end quote. Worcester. How would you respond to the idea that groups like the Workers' Party served as a kind of vehicle for immigrant intellectuals who eventually assimilated into American society? Phyllis Jacobson. If you think of people in the 1950s, people who had been around our movement who wound up as, say, academics, it was not only because the movement funneled them into the mainstream of American life. What was really going on was that in the 1930s and 1940s, there were very few stable jobs. If you were a college graduate, you're lucky if you got a job standing behind a counter in a department store. Most of the young comrades were unemployed. Julius Jacobson. And they weren't equipped to work in factories. Phyllis Jacobson. That's right. Our old friend Dave was very lucky because he worked for the city of New York, and he was rich by our standards. He made something like $30 a week. That was a great deal of money. Section 3. After the War. Julius Jacobson. Like many others, I was eventually drafted into the Army. I came back in March of 1946 and went to work for GE, where I worked for about 8 months before I quit to become a Socialist Youth League functionary. What happened was that in 1945, the Workers' Party decided that this was the time to organize a socialist youth group, and the feeling was that the high schools were the places to organize. Needless to say, this was done with minimal success. When I got back in 46, Shachtman urged me to take the job as youth organizer. I told him that so long as you have the illusion of recruiting working-class kids out of high school, you're not going to get anywhere. The only kind of youth movement you could build would be middle-class involving college kids. I would feel that even today, that a leftist group would have trouble holding on to adult workers or teenagers from working-class backgrounds. It's a very difficult thing for a worker without a profound ideological commitment to join a sectarian group and to remain in it for an extended period of time. We had nothing to offer them. We had our ideas, our idealism, and what would only have and that would only have a certain attraction for a limited period of time. Worcester. What kind of work were you able to find after the war? Phyllis Jacobson. We lived very frugally because Julie worked for the organization for the longest period of time. I did some part-time work such as reading scripts for the movies. Don't ask. I think I have to. Phyllis Jacobson. Worcester says, I think I have to. Philip Jacobson. I worked at that for years. Julius Jacobson. It all started because a friend of mine had started reading stuff for one of the movie companies. It turns out that what they did was to read almost every novel that came out, and lots of nonfiction as well, and hired readers on a freelance basis to give a synopsis of the material and to say whether it would be suitable for a film. Worcester. Presumably, most of this material was not suitable. Phyllis Jacobson. That's right, and it struck me that it was a perfect activity because I could devote myself to the organization at work at this part-time. In fact, Irving Howe and I were doing it at the exact same time for two different companies. We would call each other every week to find out who got what book, and then if we both got the same book, we would simply use the other's material. You generally received galleys, which were not pleasant to read. Julie was working for the organization, and Julie was only getting $5 a week. In order to recruit students, Julie signed up as a student at various institutions around the city. He really enjoyed the class he took at Columbia in mathematical logic. Julius Jacobson. I liked it very much and registered for the next advanced class, but it took up too much of my time and I had to drop the class. The professor wanted to know why I was giving it up. I did so well. Worcester. I read somewhere that after the war, Trotskyists became professors and communists became landlords. Phyllis Jacobson. It's true, businessmen. Julius Jacobson. We were successful in building the Socialist Youth League in this period. I don't know that we ever had more than a couple hundred members nationally, but those couple hundred, Phyllis Jacobson, were very active. Julius Jacobson. Oh, it was fantastic. We were instrumental in putting out a publication called Anvil. There was a broadly similar publication out of Chicago titled Student Partisan, which was founded in 1949. The two publications soon merged, and the new journal was titled Anvil and Student Partisan, although we usually referred to it as just Anvil. Finally, I left the Socialist Youth League in 1950. I figured I was too old for it, but I served as the editor of Anvil's first few issues. Phyllis Jacobson. And so you were. Julius Jacobson. Well, I was 28 years old at the time, and so it was time for me to move on, and the next assignment for me was to become the managing editor of the New International. Phyllis Jacobson. For many years we lived in a two-room apartment opposite the White Horse Tavern on 11th and Hudson in the Village. And when Julie and Herman Benson finally started a little machine shop of their own, Shachtman had this brilliant idea of making money for the movement by starting a long-playing record society. The Long-Playing Record Society was an imaginative Shachtman lunacy. Shachtman was very interested in the whole technology of hi-fi, and he saw this as a great opportunity to sell records. But of course you need a staff, and the staff consisted of Max, his girlfriend, and me. Ben and Julie had a shop in one part of the building on 14th Street, and the other part was the Long-Playing Record Society. Of course, the whole thing was totally loony, and then Shachtman decided to go one step further by setting up hi-fi equipment for friends and comrades. Julius Jacobson. He was a natural schemer. Phyllis Jacobson. Our office was located on 108 West 14th Street, and the party headquarters at 114 West 14th Street. And so we would run back and forth between the headquarters and the hi-fi office. Worcester. Where did you advertise this long-playing record society? Phyllis Jacobson, I don't know what we did. We must have done something because for a while it was making money, but it was an enormous amount of work. Worcester, so when did you realize that Phyllis Jacobson, the revolution wasn't coming? Worcester, the revolution wasn't coming. Phyllis Jacobson, very early on, right after the war. Worcester, did you have a sense of comrades who were drifting out of the movement and buying housing in the suburbs? Phyllis Jacobson, absolutely. Not so much that some were moving out to the suburbs, but also that some people were making scads of money. I mean, really big money. We were both scornful and angry because they were getting to be dark days. People drifted, unlike the group that started dissent, who said, quote, we're leaving, we don't agree with you, and we're going to start our own thing, end quote. At least they remained political people. Julius Jacobson. By the late 1950s, when we went into the Socialist Party, there was really nothing left. Phyllis Jacobson. It was all gone. Julius Jacobson. It sort of peaked during the war. Worcester. Were you caught up in the fashion for Freudian ideas that caught on after the war? Phyllis Jacobson. Yes, in the movement, that was a very big thing. Julius Jacobson. Everyone in our movement was interested in one aspect or another of psychoanalysis. Phyllis Jacobson. And every other person around the movement was in therapy, but it meant that they had less money to give because they had to pay their therapist. Julius Jacobson. I'd say in New York City there were maybe 80 or 90 members who were regularly going to therapy. Half the New York membership or something. It was almost considered a normal thing to do. Worcester. When did you buy your first television set? Phyllis Jacobson. We didn't get a TV until, well, our son must have been about 12 years old before he got a television set. It was in the mid-1960s. Worcester. Was Shachtman a universally popular figure in the organization? Phyllis Jacobson. Yes, he was. He was universally popular. Shachtman performed very well in public settings. Someone like Hal Draper was disadvantaged in this respect. Draper was remote. Draper was a wonderfully educated, brilliant guy who had few real friends in the movement. Jacobson. Draper was alone. Phyllis Jacobson. Draper's great fortune was that he was married to Anne, and Anne was an extremely warm, friendly person. Shachtman, on the other hand, was a dynamic figure. Shachtman had a mordant wit and was an absolutely marvelous speaker. Shachtman was also a terribly undisciplined person. Shachtman couldn't really write properly. Shachtman wouldn't do the sorts of things he should have done, such as write pamphlets and books. Shachtman couldn't. Shachtman enjoyed talking and manipulating an audience. Shachtman enjoyed displaying these flashes of brilliance. Cannon was a much better leader of an organization, but Shachtman would suck you in. From my experience, the texts that I've read by Shachtman have been very good, so I can't say that I agree with this assessment of Shachtman's writings. Julius Jacobson. And you'd forgive Shachtman. Shachtman would do and say things that you would cut someone dead for, but if Max did it, you excused him. People allowed him to get away with things. He was a politician, and generally he was very sentimental. Phyllis Jacobson. Max was very warm. Julius Jacobson. Max was warm. He'd joke and cuss. Phyllis Jacobson. If you ever saw Shachtman read a newspaper, he'd sit with the Times. His eyes would go over it, and he would absorb it almost by osmosis. He was also a bibliophile. The library consisted of Julius Jacobson, stolen books. Phyllis Jacobson, stolen books. If he came to our house, he would steal books. He would take them from everybody. He was very light-fingered. He felt that you had to give him things as his due because, after all, he sacrificed himself for the movement. Section 4. From Max Shachtman to New Politics. Worcester. Max Shachtman seems to have been largely responsible for the group's move into the Socialist Party at the end of the 1950s. Phyllis Jacobson. We joined as individuals and a number of people did not enter. I don't know that Julie ever entered, but I did. And Hal Draper didn't join the SP. Once we got into the Socialist Party, the right-wingers in the Socialist Party discovered that they had made a huge error, that Shachtman had already developed a point of view that was far to the right of theirs. While they wanted to maintain an independent Socialist Party, Shachtman basically wanted to dissolve the Socialist Party into the Democratic Party. And the left-wingers who mostly welcomed our entry into the Socialist Party were really appalled. At some point we got word that Shachtman was trying to start a new magazine with Norman Thomas and Erich Fromm. They were, ... Julius Jacobson, a strange trio. Phyllis Jacobson, an odd couple. Julius Jacobson, the idea that Shachtman was going to work in a responsible way and collaborate with Norman Thomas and Erich Fromm was absurd. Phyllis Jacobson, but other people such as ourselves were also thinking about starting a new publication. What was needed was a publication in which our views could be expressed that could reach beyond the usual milieu. Worcester, when did you realize that there was going to be a new left? Phyllis Jacobson, we knew, of course, that there was already a growing civil rights movement. You could see that something was developing and we wanted to be part of that. Worcester, what kind of political perspective was this new journal going to promote? Were you thinking of a specifically Marxist journal? Phyllis Jacobson, no. Julius Jacobson, Third Camp. Phyllis Jacobson, Third Camp and Broad. We envisioned a Debsian kind of magazine, willing to work with social democrats and so forth. It was at this point when we were formulating our plans that we went to Norman Thomas. Julie and I called his secretary. We decided at this point that truly in the Debsian spirit we would like to approach Norman Thomas. It was around this time that Shachtman showed up at our tiny apartment on 11th Street and had dinner. Shachtman asked us why we were starting a magazine. He said, quote, "What do you want? Why do you want to do this? You know we have this wonderful project, bracket, with Thomas and Fromm, end bracket, end quote." And we said, quote, "Well, you never told us you were doing it. How come you didn't inform us?" End quote. And Shachtman said, "You idiot, don't you realize you, bracket, Julius, end bracket, were going to be the editor?" End quote. The man was the most miserable liar, most incredible liar. Quote, "In any case, why do I have to inform you? I have you in my pocket," end quote. Julius Jacobson, quote, "My vest pocket," end quote. I mean, that we will never forget. Phyllis Jacobson, a vest pocket is after all a very small pocket. Anyway, that ended that. After that dinner, Shachtman started a real campaign against our project, bad-mouthing us to Norman Thomas and saying what terrible people we were. But Thomas, being Thomas, Julius Jacobson, was crucial to the project. Phyllis Jacobson, yes, we needed him very badly. Worcester, why was that? Phyllis Jacobson, because Norman Thomas was such a towering figure in the socialist movement and the left more generally. Julius Jacobson, we were really interested in a broad magazine. Thomas's participation was a way of saying that this was not going to be another new international. Phyllis Jacobson, right. It's not the same old-time stuff. Worcester, when did you decide to make a decisive break with the explicitly Marxist approach of New International? Julius Jacobson, it wasn't a break. What carried over was the idea of a third camp, but it wasn't the third camp as developed by a revolutionary socialist Marxist tendency. It was a time to create a publication in which those views could be expressed in ... Phyllis Jacobson, an open forum. Julius Jacobson, in an open forum with others. Phyllis Jacobson, we realized that the time was different. After all, we ended up as a sect with practically no members. We ended with zilch. We had nobody coming around. In any case, Norman Thomas welcomed us. Norman Thomas was very old and we could see that he was very tired. But we started the discussion and Thomas sat there with an odd smile on his face, listening to what we had to say. He looked as though he was asleep some of the time, but he wasn't sleeping for a second. He had all his wits about him. We told him what we wanted to do and urged him to give us his support. We told him that we wanted to have a broad publication, and Thomas said yes. Norman Thomas also cast aspersions on Shachtman and his way of dealing with people. He was not at all happy with Shachtman's machinations. What he was saying in effect was, quote, "I may look like an old fool, but you better believe that I'm not," end quote. And that it did. And that did it. Julius Jacobson, with that we made a formal announcement. Phyllis Jacobson, I was a member of the Socialist Party's National Committee and there was a meeting at this time in Philadelphia. At some point, I asked the National Committee to let our new journal, which we decided to call New Politics, have access to the Socialist Party mailing list. Shachtman started making one of these absolutely Shachtman-esque speeches, quote, "Why should we give them the mailing list? Who are these people who come in the dead of the night?" End quote. One of the old right-wingers in the Socialist Party took the floor and said, quote, "What are you talking about? These are your comrades, Phyllis and Julie Jacobson. What dead of night are you talking about?" End quote. The right-wingers were very offended, and so we did get the list. And of course, that was a very good start because Socialist Party had an extensive list at that point, and then we started promoting the magazine. Julius Jacobson. Some of the early issues were quite good. Hal Draper wrote some very good articles for us, and the first issue of New Politics sold 3,000 or 4,000 copies. Phyllis Jacobson. Yes, it was very thick. Julie always believes the bigger the better, but raising money was hard. We were always falling behind in terms of the publishing schedule because we could not raise the necessary funds. Now mind, it was a quarterly, which is very difficult to sustain. One of the greatest difficulties had to do with getting proper distribution. Our distributor at the beginning was Eastern News. They placed it on some newsstands. The newsstand at 42nd near 5th Avenue used to sell 100 copies per issue. Julius Jacobson. But the way things worked out, the journal came out roughly 3¼ times a year. Phyllis Jacobson, instead of 4. And I kept writing these wonderful letters to the post office because they wanted to take away our second-class mailing rights. We wrote fabulous double-talking letters about why we were always late, but we held on to our rights. Worcester. Was the journal read by the members of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society? Phyllis Jacobson. Oh, I'm sure there were SDS members who read it. Julius Jacobson. But the rank and file of SDS were not very big on reading intellectual journals. That was one of the tragic flaws of SDS. It was an ideological movement in many ways. Phyllis Jacobson. But the whole development of SDS, Julius Jacobson, was a missed opportunity. Phyllis Jacobson. Of course, the Shachtmanites played an absolutely scandalous role vis-a-vis SDS. Julius Jacobson. The hostility of the Shachtmanites and the coldness of Michael Harrington and others was such a put-off. Ironically, the one person in our movement who was really able to establish a rapport with SDS and with the New Left on a political and personal level was Hal Draper. Phyllis Jacobson. Draper really did. Draper established a great rapport with these young people. Julius Jacobson. But for us, we wanted to put out an intellectual publication, and we had a completely different attitude about the New Left in comparison to people like Shachtman, Harrington, and Howe, but we couldn't really make contact with them for various historical and political reasons. Worcester. Did you have any kind of interaction with Socialist Workers' Party members? Do you know if someone like James Cannon, for example, saw the journal? Phyllis Jacobson. Never. They subscribed. The party would get 2 copies of each issue, and to this day they receive 2 copies. Julius Jacobson. That was a different world from us. We had no contact with them at all. Worcester. How did you feel about the contrast between the early 1960s, a period in which socialist humanist ideas flourished, and the late 1960s, when many young people were embracing all kinds of revolutionary fantasies? Phyllis Jacobson. It was very demoralizing. We realized our time was up by the late 1970s, when we couldn't get people to write for the journal. In a period of 10 years, the culture went from extreme revolutionary optimism to a lack of interest in politics. Julius Jacobson. When the Vietnam War ended and the anti-war movement fell apart, it became clear that it was a one-issue movement, and you no longer had that issue. As a result, there was a tremendous wave of demoralization, and the journal was affected by it. We felt that we had to give it up, even though, when we folded, we had 330 library subscriptions. Phyllis Jacobson. We did have writers who were attracted by the magazine and wanted to contribute to it, but most of the unsolicited submissions were unusable. The other thing is that while some people seemed to appreciate New Politics in the 1970s, It never developed the kind of rapport with its writers that it does right now. We have a number of contributors who have become really dear friends of the magazine, such as Mark Dow, for example, Phil Smith, Steve Steinberg. They call and say, quote, "I want to write an article," end quote. Unfortunately, we weren't able to convince Hal Draper to contribute to the magazine when we started it up again. We had offended Hal politically in the 1960s because we thought it was wrong to start a new sect. We did not think it was the season for that particular vegetable. Worcester, referring to, question mark? Phyllis Jacobson, the independent socialist clubs, which later became the International Socialists. This was in the late 1960s. We thought that launching a new socialist group was not a great idea, and we did not want to join. He was very angry because we did not join his effort. Worcester, do you want to say something about where the journal is currently headed? Has it met your expectations since the magazine's relaunch? Phyllis Jacobson, I would say that it has more than met my expectations. There's nothing as gratifying as having good writers calling up, asking to write on particular topics, but putting it out on a regular basis is still difficult. It's hard to find the necessary resources. You cannot stop promoting the journal. Julius Jacobson, it's a matter of capitalist economics. You need capital, and we just don't have it. With the money we raise, we can just about come out and maintain what we have, but it's impossible to expand. I figure if we received a lump sum of $25,000 or $30,000, we could expand the magazine to the point where it would become self-sufficient. That's the end of the piece proper. But there's a further readings here. It says, John Bloom and Paul Bull, The Legacy of the Workers' Party, 1940 to 49, Reflections and Recollections. How the fuck have I never seen this book before? That's fucking insane. I don't know, maybe it sucks or something, I don't know. James P. Cannon, The Struggle for a Proletarian Party, published 1943. Lynn Chancer, A Personal and Political Tribute to Phyllis Jacobson, published in summer 2010. Peter Drucker, Max Shachtman has left a socialist odyssey through the, quote, American century, published in 1994. Available on this channel. Ernest Haberkern and Arthur Lippau's edited volume, Neither Capitalism Nor Socialism, Theories of Bureaucratic Collectivism, published in 1996. Sam Farber, Julius Jacobson, 1922 to 2003, published in Against the Current, July-August 2003. Barry Finger, Standing Fast, Julius Jacobson, published in New Politics, summer 2003. Burton Hall's edited volume, Autocracy and Insurgency in Organized Labor. Irving Howe, A Margin of Hope, an intellectual biography. Maurice Eiserman, If I Had a Hammer, The Death of the Old Left and the Birth of the New Left, published in 1987. Julius Jacobson's edited volume, The Negro and the American Labor Movement. Julius Jacobson's edited volume, Soviet Communism and the Socialist Vision. Phyllis and Julius Jacobson's edited volume, Socialist Perspectives. 1983. Max Shachtman, The Bureaucratic Revolution, The Rise of the Stalinist State. Harvey Swato's Standing Fast, 1970. Leon Trotsky, In Defense of Marxism. Alan Wald, The New York Intellectuals, The Rise and Decline of the Anti-Stalinist Left from the 1930s to the 1980s. And Kent Worcester, C.L.R. James, A Political Biography, published in 1996, which I just finished reading and will be up on this channel. If not by the time this video is up, at least several chapters from the video will be up. Thank you so much for listening.